the reason why it's confusing for me is I can't tell. Part of it comes just down to feeling. I never feel like I'm happy about making sure we've got the 2 data centers operational in diverse countries, kind of I can't really tell whether or not I'm happy about it. There's nothing really exciting about it. It's just...
Well, it might be because it's not personal to you, and it might be because it's just the next natural step. In other words, Esther has noticed that as big things happen in their experience now, that in former years would just knock her socks off, now when big things happen, because it's so the feeling of the next logical step, she doesn't have that bouncing off the wall feeling of enthusiasm about it. And it's because it's just the next logical step. We promise you that if you were standing in a place where the contingency or the solution did not exist, and you were faced with a dilemma of some of the things that you've been focused upon, and you believed that this looming disaster or dilemma were imminent, and you had no solution or contingency plan in place, that you would feel the trauma of that discord. And then if in the middle of that trauma somehow you were to find the miraculous miracle or solution, you would be yahooing down the street like nobody you've ever known, because the contrast would have been so severe that the problem would have loomed great and the solution would have loomed great. But it doesn't happen that way, because you can't find a solution to a big problem, because if it's a big problem and you see it as a big problem, you're not on the vibrational wavelength that gives you the solution. Isn't this interesting? In other words, a little problem makes you have a little desire, and there's not much spread between where you are and where you want to be, so you can easily accomplish it. But if you have a big problem which causes you to have a big desire, now you can't get to the solution because there's too big of a spread between where you're vibrating and where the answer is. So it's a very common thing when the contrast causes you to want and you find vibrational alignment with it. It's a very common thing for you to be so up to speed with the next logical step that you don't feel that strong emotion about it. Sometimes people don't feel emotion simply because they've numbed themselves out. They've felt so much negative emotion and they can't bear it, and so they just disregard their feelings. But that's not what's going on here. You are closer in alignment with the desires that you are setting forth. It's part of the nature of the work in which you've been trained. They've done a good job in pointing out to you what could happen and asking you for solutions. And we know that in those beginning stages of looking for solutions, your juices were really flowing. Now you're just sort of oriented. In fact, it's not a bad way to be. We love seeing Jerry and Esther and recognizing that they know that no matter what, they're going to be able to figure it out. The other morning they got up, they had a 500 or 600 mile drive to make, or nearly so. And they had timed themselves. They did some work in the coach, and Esther is always plotting how many miles it is and what will the traffic be like as they move through different cities and when's the best time to leave, and she's always trying to guide them, Jerry too, in that way. And so they had planned to leave about 10 o'clock, and so when it was time to leave, Jerry went out and unplugged things and brought the hoses in, and Esther did her stowing of things inside the bus, and then Esther sat in the driver's seat as she always does and started the engine and turned it on high idle, because this big engine doesn't want to sit there and idle at low idle, and so it makes a real ruckus. And then she opened some windows, because now she's going to push the button that brings the big room inside. And if you bring the big room inside without opening windows, it's hard on everything in there because it's such an airtight enclosure. And so Esther opens the windows and pushes the button, and the big room begins to slide in, and she always watches it in her rearview mirror. She watches this big mammoth of a thing move in, and it moved all the way in except for the last inch, which means they can't drive because the big locking pins can't come in. In other words, it was a malfunction. So she pushed the out button and nothing happened. So she pushed the in button and nothing happened. So she radios Jerry on the walkie-talkie and says, "Why don't you lean on that and see what will happen?" And he laughs just like that, because there's not enough strength in any human to make any difference in this big thing. And so, but Esther said, no problem, because they have a contingency plan. I read in the manual where if the slider does not come in, and they had actually had the experience before, there is another way of doing it. And Jerry said, let's call technical support. And Esther said, I know what to do. I wrote it down. So she went to her notes and turned to them step by step. And so they went out, opened one of the under bins, took everything out of the bin, took the wall off of the bin, it's velcroed on, and there is all the internal contraptions for the slide out. And so there is a little piece that she hooks on. It looks like a remote control, a manual thing that she hooks on to the contingency plan that they have inside. And she read her notes, turned this a quarter of a turn, and as she did that, she hears hiss as the air is released from the big slider. And then turn this, and she hears the locking pins deactivate themselves. And then it says, push this button and watch it so that you line it up just the way you want it. And so she pushed it, and the slider came right in. And then it says, reverse these steps. So she turned this, which made the air come back up, and she turned this, which made the locking pins come in. And then she said, so nice to be empowered. In other words, contingency plans. And you know what we noticed as Esther is acknowledging those contingency plans is that she didn't feel normal panic. In other words, that's a time for panic. When you've got a bus that you can't bring the slider in, and if you can't bring the slider in, you can't drive, and you have some place you need to be 600 miles away, and there is no one anywhere in this hemisphere that can work on it, there is reason for panic. But if you have a contingency plan, in other words, what a nice thing to know that no matter what, we can figure out what to do, no matter what. In other words, they tow that car because they know no matter what, they could close that bus up, get in the car, and get anywhere they need to be. And if the car won't run, there's a rental car that they can get. You see what we're getting at? In other words, you have these contingency plans because what you say to yourself is, this is where I am and this is where I want to be, and one way or another, I can figure out how to get there. And we can find nothing in that philosophy of life that can be anything other than forward-looking and positive in nature. Can you? So then you say, yeah, but Abraham, I'm actually making trouble. I'm actually making trouble. And we say, yeah. Somebody somewhere who created that bus said, what if someday some nice couple needs to be somewhere and they get in and they push their button and the slider doesn't come all the way in? Then what? And someone else said, we need a contingency plan. And no one said, oh, you're just asking for trouble. If you create a contingency plan, then there'll just be a whole lot of people that tear their coach apart to use the contingency plan. Nobody will want to push the easy button anymore. They'll all be down there. And we say, there isn't anything that you can do that gives you great, reasonable expectation that you can get to where you want to be. We're all for it. In fact, we think that creation is about contingency plans. Because we know that all of you, in your sifting through the data, are putting things out there in your future that you have no knowledge initially of how to accomplish. And if it were not for those far-reaching minds that are willing to look for solutions to problems that maybe haven't even arisen fully, everything would slow down. Isn't it nice that there are people out there willing to think in advance? Now, we've just given you about 100 downstream thoughts. Now get out.